Good afternoon. Unfortunately, we have votes on the floor, and one of the reasons you don't see some other members who usually appear at this particular committee is that it was unclear exactly what time they were going to start votes. So if we had another member here, I was going to go ahead and get at least the opening statements in, but I can't start it without another member, and so we will have to adjourn for votes. There are only two, probably be about a half hour because the first vote is 15 minutes, which really means 20 to 25. And then the second one is a 5-minute vote, and then we can dash back over here. So approximately a half hour. I apologize. So we are adjourned for votes on the floor. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and reconvene. We have a second member here. I can at least get my opening statement in, and yeah, well, you can actually. All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. The subcommittee come to order. Good afternoon. I want to welcome all of my colleagues, those here and not here, to this hearing of the Subcommittee on the Middle East and South Asia. The purpose of this hearing is to follow up the recent full committee hearing with the Secretary of State and the USAID Administrator. Today we will focus on the Middle East component of the fiscal year 2013 budget, and next week we'll hear from administration officials on the South Asia component. Just over a year ago, this subcommittee heard testimony on the fiscal year 2012 budget. Although many of the themes that I am sure we will discuss are similar, the context could not be more different. A year ago, I was cautiously optimistic that the so-called Arab Spring might usher democracy and human rights into a region where both have been exceptions rather than the rule. Now, a year later, the picture looks very different. The Muslim Brotherhood is on the verge of holding virtually complete control in the Egyptian civilian government. Syria is collapsing into a civil war, potentially, in which nearly 12,000 people have already perished, and there seems to be no end in sight. The regime in Tehran has all but quashed all popular opposition and continues to advance in its quest for a nuclear weapons capability. Israelis and Palestinians do not even appear to be close to resuming negotiations despite repeated Israeli overtures. And Iraq, which had looked surprisingly stable, is embroiled in a political crisis which, if not checked, has the potential to sink the entire country back into widespread sectarian conflict. We certainly hope that does not happen, pray that that does not happen, but that could very well be what we have facing us. And on top of that, international institutions like the United Nations have ground to a halt due to foot-dragging by countries like Russia and China, who continue to shirk their own responsibilities as members of the international community. But while the region continues to change, U.S. core national security interests have not. Maintaining shipping lanes, securing energy for the world economy, ensuring regional stability, and combating terrorism still remain critical priorities. Collectively, the current situation poses one of the most serious challenges in the Middle East that the U.S. has faced in decades. And while I am sure that the administration understands the nature of the challenges, I'm not so sure that its policies are the most effective in addressing them. The flagship program in the fiscal year 2013 budget is the proposed Middle East and North African Incentive Fund, which, despite its $770 million price tag and very broad authorities, appears to share the same core mechanism as many other assistance programs. Many assistance programs are intended to incentivize countries to reform. Very few of them cost nearly $1 billion and require notwithstanding authority. Furthermore, I fear this fund risks reinforcing a chronic bad behavior in the implementation of our foreign assistance, substituting money for thoughtful policy. Reflexively throwing taxpayer dollars at problems is not effective policy, and I fear the lack of details about how this fund will operate, as well as the very broad authorities requested, make it more likely that the money will at best be wasted and will at worst enable hasty and reckless policy. I have my doubts about our country-specific policies as well. The administration's current policy in Syria relies on sanctions and diplomacy, and while the sanctions that have been implemented by the U.S. and its allies around the world are certainly having an effect, I fear they will not achieve the stated goal to actually bring about the removal of Assad from power. Similarly, some today are looking to Kofi Annan's six-point plan for Syria and the establishment of a UN observer mission with optimism. I'm afraid that I do not share this optimism, and I hope our witnesses here today will discuss what next steps the administration is planning if and likely when the current diplomacy fails. In Egypt, the administration, Egyptians, or both, do not seem to have grasped the seriousness of the situation. The December 29, 2011 raid on civil society NGOs calls into question the government of Egypt's commitment to the principles of democratic governance. And although it may not have intended to do so, the administration's decision on March 23rd to waive a certification on Egyptian democratic progress prior to the obligation of military aid sent the wrong message to parties throughout the region that when push comes to shove, our money will keep flowing, despite whatever pre-existing conditions we may have set. Furthermore, a near obsessional fear of the perceived foreign intervention among Egyptians limits what kind of assistance may be possible going forward, even with the best bilateral relationship. Decisions about U.S. foreign assistance must ultimately be shaped by the choices and policies made by regional governments. We have an interest in strongly supporting democratic governments that respect the rights of their citizens and rule of law, that foster greater economic opportunity, and that observe international obligations. I fear, however, that if the current trajectory of the region continues unchanged, our assistance programs to many of the countries in question will have to be reevaluated. And at this time, Mr. Ackerman, I don't know if you can get in your talk in about 3 or 4 minutes. Probably not. If not, perhaps we should go ahead and adjourn, go to the floor, and come back. So we will go ahead and do that then at this point. So we'll be back in maybe a little less than half hour since we used up some of the 20 minutes in this vote. So we're in recess for a short period of time.
Damn it, Steve, now I'm not going to remember what you said.
The committee will come back to order. It's been brought to my attention that we have a number of distinguished high-ranking officers from around the world who are with us here this afternoon, currently at the War College. And on behalf of the subcommittee, we would like to ask them to perhaps stand, and we'd like to welcome them to our committee and thank them for their service. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And at this time, by popular demand, it's been suggested that I should give my opening statement again. Just kidding. So we will, at this point, turn to the ranking member of the committee, the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Gary Ackerman, to give his opening statement.
I think there's been an equal demand that I not make any statement. We'll proceed as we usually do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Chairman organized today's hearing to discuss our priorities in foreign assistance in the Middle East in the coming year. I'll tell you what the first priority ought to be: meeting the President's request for increased foreign assistance in the Middle East in the coming year. At a time when the entire region is in the midst of a generational upheaval and with the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapons capability drawing near, and it absolutely must be stopped, now is not the time to stuff our hands in our pockets and say that we've been doing enough. Nothing can be more short-sighted and contrary to our national security interests in the region than to draw back on our commitments, or worse, pull back, disengage, and leave the region's fate to be determined wholly by others. In the current fiscal year, U.S. foreign assistance will total an estimated $37.7 billion, or 1.0% of the total federal budget. By comparison, defense spending will exceed $646 billion. It's not a question of either or, but one of scale. Diplomacy and foreign assistance is every bit as critical and usually much more cost-effective at protecting and advancing American interests. To be clear, foreign assistance needs to be understood as a vital element of our overall national strategy, not a soft-headed but compulsory form of charity that we impose upon our taxpayers. We have a foreign operations budget for the same reason that we have a Marine Corps. It proactively helps to protect America, and it advances our vital interests in national security by dealing with problems over there before they become problems over here. September 11th should have proved once and for all that even if we don't visit bad neighborhoods, and especially if we don't visit bad neighborhoods, they will visit us. For many years, the Near East has been America's top recipient region. In FY 2012, we'll spend an estimated $8 billion, and wisely, the Obama administration has requested a $1 billion plus-up for the region in FY 2013. While a significant increase, the justification is obvious. The region in which we have vital political, economic, and military interests is in the midst of a metamorphosis. And we continue to have vital allies who are counting on us to fulfill our commitments to their security. So now, in addition to our traditional objectives of promoting peace, development, and the spread of democracy, human rights, and liberal values, we have a host of specific short-term challenges stemming from the remarkable and radical changes that have been transforming the region. There is the struggle of the Syrian people to free themselves from the Assad dictatorship. This change, when it succeeds, and I believe we must facilitate that success to our utmost, will depend on the strategic architecture of the region and deliver a fatal wound to Iranian dreams of hegemony. Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Yemen are all struggling to steady themselves and put new governments, which we certainly hope will be democratic in outlook as well as origin, on solid foundations, all while addressing the truly exigent problems within. On the Arabian Peninsula and in the Levant, radical violent Islamists are seeking to exploit the chaos while ever seeking new havens from which they can plan attacks, including attacks on the United States. Our commitment to Iraq is ongoing, and our support for Jordan and Lebanon and Morocco is as well. Finally, the bedrock commitment that we've made to Israel, which remains a target for all radical and malevolent forces in the region, must be sustained and strengthened. At a time when Arabs are fighting and struggling for democracy and the fruits of limited government and rule of law, we must continue our support for the one and only truly shining example of these things in the entire region. And while I'm bitterly disappointed with the absurd decision by President Abbas last year to seek statehood from the UN, which can't give it, while refusing to negotiate with Israel, which can, I continue to believe that it's in the interest of both the United States and the State of Israel to continue our assistance to the Palestinian Authority. The transformations wrought by Prime Minister Fayyad in terms of law and order, economic growth, and the maturation of government operations are nothing short of remarkable. And while they absolutely could not have happened without the support of the United States. While the two sides remain at odds presently, I remain convinced that Israel will one day be the midwife of a new Palestinian state for the simple reason that it's in its own vital interest in remaining both a Jewish and a democratic state will compel it to do so. When that day comes, our efforts to support the Palestinian state-building enterprise will yield remarkable dividends. Instead of a failed state or a terror state unable to sustain itself, Israel will have another neighbor able to fulfill its obligation both from without and within. The Middle East, we know for so long, is dead, and a new region is being born. Like many newborn, we do not know what will become of it, and in truth, it is not for us to determine. What we can and should do is to help within our means, offer counsel and assistance to those who seek it, and remain stalwart in our protection of our partners, our allies, and our friends.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ackram. Appreciate it. At this time, members, if they would so choose, will have 1 minute to make an opening statement if they'd like to. We'll first recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing today. Assistant Secretary Feltman, Ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, good to see you. Ms. Rudman, thank you for joining us today, as well as you, Mr. Ward. I know we're going to discuss our efforts as a U.S. government toward meaningful engagement in the Middle East during this important time of transition with all of its uncertainty and difficulties. I'd like to state that, briefly, my priorities for the region are threefold and intertwined. First, it's to prevent wide-scale conflict, protect Israel in view of the apocalyptic threats levied against its very existence, and third is to help promote just civil societies and governance structures throughout the region that reflect, that respect and reflect the needs of local populations struggling to realize their basic human rights. So there is much to unpack in that brief statement, and I look forward to your commentary today and the follow-up questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mr. Connolly, is recognized for a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our panel for being here and you for holding this hearing. And I want to applaud you for your opening statement, much of which I certainly agree with, and the caveats contained therein definitely worthy of holding in mind. However, I would respectfully suggest it is premature. I just got back from Egypt. It is premature to pass judgment on events that are unfolding in Egypt. Some make us highly uncomfortable, absolutely, and they should. But we need to give this a little bit of time, and we need to tread softly, lest we unwittingly create outcomes we wish to avoid. And then secondly, the chairman rightfully listed, enumerated many, many interests the United States has in this region, and I agree with all of them. But I say to the chairman and my colleagues, especially on the other side of the aisle, the answer is not to disengage because we have these concerns. The answer is to continue to engage and invest, however difficult the terrain. That's what a great power does. And so I look forward to this hearing, and I look forward to having the opportunity to further examine the issues the chairman so ably laid out for us.
Thank you very much. I believe, Mr. Bilirakis, you're not, okay. Thank you very much. And I believe next was Mr. Chandler, the gentleman from Kentucky, no? I'm fine, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and who also is from a Commonwealth. And Ms. Schwartz, Pennsylvania, were you interested? Pass, okay. Mr. Murphy from Connecticut. And finally, last but not least, Mr. Higgins. Okay, excellent. Well, then we can go ahead and introduce our panel here this afternoon, and we have a very distinguished panel. We appreciate them being here. I will start with Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman, who was sworn in as Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs on August 18, 2009. A career member of the Foreign Service since January 1986, Ambassador Feltman previously served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, and from July 2004 to January 2008, he served as the U.S. Ambassador to Lebanon. Prior to his assignment in Lebanon, he served in Iraq, Israel, and Tunisia. And we welcome you here this afternoon, Mr. Ambassador. Our next witness will be Mara Rudman, and prior to becoming the Assistant Administrator for the Middle East at USAID, Mara Rudman was a Deputy Envoy and Chief of Staff for the Office of the Special Envoy for Middle East Peace. She served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Executive Secretary to the National Security Council under President Obama from January through May 2009, and as the Deputy National Security Advisor and National Security Council Chief of Staff to President Clinton from 1999 to 2001. Earlier in her career, she served as Chief Counsel to the House Foreign Affairs Committee under Chairman Lee Hamilton. Thank you very much for being here. And finally, Mark Ward is a career minister in the U.S. Senior Foreign Service and currently serves as the Deputy Special Coordinator in the Office of Middle East Transition at the U.S. Department of State. From July 2010 to September 2011, he served as Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Democracy, Conflict and Humanitarian Assistance, and Acting Director of the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance at USAID. Mr. Ward was the Special Advisor on Development to the head of the United Nations mission in Afghanistan, based in Kabul from October 2008 until July 2010. And we welcome all three of you here this afternoon. And as you know, we have a 5-minute rule, and there's a lighting system. The yellow light will come on and let you know that you have about a minute to wrap up. The red light comes on, your 5 minutes are up, and we'd appreciate it if you'd wrap up at or close to that time. And we'll begin with you, Ambassador Feldman. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Ackerman, distinguished members of the committee, thanks for inviting us to this hearing on this important subject. It's my pleasure to be here with my colleague, Mara Rudman from AID, and Deputy Coordinator for Middle East Transitions, Mark Ward. As the committee knows, the Middle East has both immediate and long-term strategic interests to our country. Mr. Chairman, you outlined some of those interests. Our critical national interests include countering violent extremism and Iran's destabilizing role, securing Israel and promoting Arab-Israeli peace, supporting reform, respect for human rights, and successful transitions to democracy, and maintaining free flows of energy and commerce. Ultimately, each of these affects the lives and the livelihoods of Americans and America's friends abroad. Already, we face new realities in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and elsewhere. At the same time, every country in the region is affected by the same powerful forces. This means, in part, that parties rooted in religious faith will play larger roles. We do not yet know how our relationships will evolve with emerging governments, parliaments, and civil societies in these countries, and this presents a challenge for budgeting into an uncertain future. But what we do know is that our core national interests have not changed, while the environment in which we pursue them is changing dramatically. And we need to respond accordingly by establishing new partnerships while maintaining old ones, positioning ourselves to protect and promote our interests and help shape and influence outcomes. In this rapidly changing environment, this requires patience, creativity, and flexibility, and our ability to succeed will depend on your support. When we observe new parties coming to power, we hear many of their leaders saying the right things, but President Obama and Secretary Clinton have been crystal clear that the United States will judge these parties based not on their words, but on their actions, and whether they uphold their commitments to promoting peace, to the democratic rules of the game, and to the rights of minority communities and women. During this historic period of transition, the United States government is faced, as Mr. Connolly said, with a clear choice. On the one hand, we could disengage and wait and see what happens. On the other hand, we could engage proactively and seek to shape outcomes that are more favorable to our interests and to our friends, and start building today the foundations for renewed, sustainable partnerships. I understand the temptation to wait to deliver assistance until we are certain of what will happen, but that's a recipe for diminished influence. We are not just a bystander in this drama, nor do I believe we can afford to act that part. We have to make the investments that allow us to support our interests and values at a time when many of the old arrangements are giving or changing way. Should we step back, others who do not share our values stand ready to try to fill the void. Our forward-leaning engagement, helping the region meet its challenges through partnership, is one of the best bulwarks we have against Iranian ambitions to dominate the region. A key element of our policy response is the proposal to create the Middle East North Africa Incentive Fund. With your support, this proposal would provide the means to incentivize the far-reaching reforms that are needed to achieve regional security and fulfill the legitimate aspirations held by the region's people. Lack of these reforms will continue to undermine our interests across the board. Recognizing the magnitude of these issues, the MENA Incentive Fund represents a new approach for our engagement. Its structure bolsters reformers within these governments and societies. It ties substantial assistance to robust and credible reform agendas developed in partnership with governments and their civil societies linked to achieving transparent benchmarks. Simply put, this tool, both in its size and its flexibility, is badly needed to protect our interests and build successful partnerships with the region in transition. Throughout this process, we will actively include Congress in our discussions. We have a lot on our plate. To protect our enduring interests, we must ensure that the root causes of the upheavals of the past year, from Tunisia to Syria, are answered by the emergence of greater freedom, greater dignity, greater opportunity in a region that has seen too little for too long. This is a future that is essential to the interests of the people of the region and to the United States. Thank you for your consideration and your cooperation as we pursue these critical goals.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And also, I would note perfect timing as far as keeping within the limits. Excellent. So, and good testimony as well. Ms. Rudman, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Ackerman, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss our FY13 budget. We see in the Middle East a region of great hope and opportunity, but also one facing daunting challenges. USAID's assistance, as part of a broader, coordinated U.S. government effort, not only delivers on America's values, but also constitutes an investment in the safety, security, and prosperity of this critically important region. USAID's development experience allows us to address the basics that fueled the Arab Spring, people's desire for improved opportunities today and a better tomorrow for themselves and their children. We are responding to these aspirations and needs by providing assistance that helps citizens engage with their governments and helps governments respond to the will of their people. Our FY13 budget priorities work to ensure that democracies everywhere share some crucial traits, including a robust civil society, healthy institutions and legal frameworks that protect the basic rights of all citizens, no matter their gender, religion, or class. We are reaching out to new audiences, new partners, to more young people and increasing numbers of women, and to areas well beyond capital cities. Young people in these countries, women and men, want to participate in the economic as well as political future of their societies. We have recognized the need to be more agile and flexible in our approach. As we do so, we continue to rely on our core strengths, knowledge of the societies in which we work, experience in political and economic transitions worldwide, and a dedicated team of Americans and local staff working to help people who are struggling to make a better life. Our budget request for FY13 in the region is $1.4 billion. The MENA IF request is on top of that. Countries in the region contend with similar development challenges but are coming from different places in terms of their recent political history. So the nature of our approach and our assistance differs. In countries that are experiencing violent unrest, such as Syria, USAID, as part of a coordinated U.S. government effort, has stepped in to provide vital humanitarian assistance. In Egypt, Tunisia, and Yemen, each experience its own unique transition. USAID has provided varying types of support for economic growth and civil society work. Still, other countries in the region are experiencing quieter transformations. Morocco and Jordan are moving forward with reforms to enhance citizen participation and voice in government, as well as to create opportunities for the future. In Lebanon, USAID is supporting development of economic opportunities, supporting civil society and citizen engagement, and contributing substantially in the education sector, where we support programs for meritorious youth from underserved areas. In Iraq, in FY13, USAID's focus is on helping Iraqis use their own resources to build a self-reliant country by continuing support for the development of governing institutions at all levels and working with civil society organizations, including to assist vulnerable populations to assert their rights and entitlements. In the West Bank and Gaza, the United States' goal is to achieve comprehensive and lasting peace. We seek to operationalize this through two tracks: negotiations to establish a Palestinian state and support for Palestinian institution building so that the new state has a capacity to govern and to help ensure security, stability, and needed services. USAID's work is critical to implement this second track. USAID coordinates closely with our colleagues at state to design and support effective programs. We will work with our state colleagues and those at other government agencies on the $770 million Middle East and North Africa Incentive Fund, the MENA-IF, which Assistant Secretary Feltman has discussed, and is proposed in the President's FY13 budget. This fund, which is designed in part to reward those governments with the political will to commit to economic and political reforms that will support democratic change, building effective institutions, and broad-based economic growth, is critical for our ability to work throughout the region, and we welcome questions on it. New programs like the MENA-IF leverage the remarkable recent transformation that has occurred in the region. The storyline in the Middle East is continuing to evolve, no doubt about it. But it is clear that the future of the Middle East is firmly in the hands and the hearts of people in the region. I am confident that the President's FY 2013 budget, including the investments we have proposed, lays the groundwork for USAID and our fellow agencies to address the challenges and advance the beneficial change we have begun to see in the region. We all appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and we're happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ward, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
No statement, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. All right, we'll move on to questions at this time, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for that purpose. And I'll open this to any of the folks who would like to address it. It's been 6 weeks approximately since the Obama administration granted Egypt its full $1.3 billion in annual military aid, despite the Egyptian government's failure to meet conditions set by Congress for advancing democracy. In granting a waiver on national security grounds, administration officials argued that continuing the funding was more likely to encourage cooperation with the United States and progress on human rights than a cutoff would. But in a number of tangible ways, U.S.-Egyptian relations and the military's treatment of civil society have deteriorated since the waiver was issued back on March 23rd. The threat to non-governmental organizations whose prosecution triggered the threat of an aid suspension has arguably worsened. Furthermore, Egypt's government-controlled press has continued a toxic campaign of anti-Americanism. The State Department also argued that aid should continue because Egypt had stuck to the 1979 Camp David agreements with Israel. But after the waiver, the government unilaterally canceled a deal under which it was supplying Israel with natural gas, for example. Given all of these deteriorations, was granting Egypt's military assistance through a national security waiver a mistake or not? And also, has the U.S. lost its leverage to push for democracy in Egypt through its military rulers? And what damage has this done, if any, in U.S. credibility in promoting democracy in the region? And Ambassador Feltman, I'd start with you, but anybody else who wants to respond is welcome to do so.
Mr. Chairman, thanks for the question. It's an extremely important topic that was subject to a lot of discussion, inside the U.S. government. What was the best approach given the options on the table? When you look at Egypt in the macro sense, I think you can see a lot of progress has taken place over the past year and a half. There have certainly been problems, and you've outlined many of them very eloquently. But we've also seen a country that has had multiple rounds for parliamentary elections that have been free and fair. You've had a military government that has, as recently as this week, reiterated its commitment to turn over power to civilian authorities by July 1st. This is not business as usual in Egypt. Anything but that. You have a transition that is underway, warts and all, moving forward toward that transfer back to civilian authority. The Egyptian military is going to be one of our partners in Egypt moving forward. I mentioned in my opening statement, we need to be nurturing new partnerships. We need to be cultivating old partnerships, and Egypt is a good example. Egypt is critical to our national security interests, whether it comes to arms smuggling, counterterrorism, Suez Canal, overflight issues. It is a key element to regional stability. You mentioned the Camp David Accords. Egypt maintains its commitments to a Camp David Accord, and Egypt has made remarkable progress toward transition. This was the right decision that the Secretary made in offering the waiver. It doesn't mean that everything in Egypt has been going perfectly, but in a very broad sense, you have had much more progress toward democratic rule in Egypt over the past year and a half than you've had in 60 years, and that progress continues.
Then just a couple of things, and you didn't mention these. I'd ask you to comment on those. One thing, the threat to non-governmental entities that has continued on a course that we certainly don't think is particularly helpful, and then the campaign in the media there of ongoing anti-American rhetoric that's been ramped up and ramped up. And then, of course, you mentioned, yes, the Camp David Accords are still in existence, but when they cut off something as important as a natural gas supply to Israel, it certainly seems inconsistent with the spirit of the agreement. So could you comment on those three specifically?
Yes. One reason why the Secretary waived rather than certified was because the freedom of association has had some good news and some bad news. The good news is that there are many more NGOs, local Egyptian NGOs, operating at all levels across the country now. There's much more freedom for association than there was 2, 3, 4 years ago in Egypt today. But there are still severe restrictions on some NGOs. We want the case against the American, German, and other NGOs that's still underway to be dropped. And so the Secretary had, waived the certification on the right of association because of the continuing restrictions, but there has been a lot of progress made. On the media, there are many more free media options available to Egyptians now than there were a few years ago. There's been progress, but you're right, there's still state-controlled media that is putting out sort of articles that do trouble us, and there's still some crackdown on bloggers and independent media. So it's another mixed bag. The reason why it goes to the certification on the gas, Sinai gas. Both sides have told us, the Egyptians and the Israelis have both told us that this is a commercial dispute at this point, and that they wish to resolve this through commercial negotiations, through commercial means, and that they would prefer that we not raise this as an issue at the political level because both sides are interpreting it as a commercial issue.
Right. Thank you. My time's actually expired, so I'm going to, at this point, yield to the gentleman from New York, ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The region is beset with change. I think if you read the roll call of nations within the region, everybody seems to be undergoing some kind of pressure. Few of them are minor. Most of them are huge. Most of them have a dimension of tremendous uncertainty. Some of them have changed national leaders, some of whom have left. Some of whom are on trial, some of whom are still there but we're trying to push out, some of whom have governments that are incapable of governing. Some of them will have a government that is completely strange and unknown to us. Most of them seem to be having parties and candidates arise that were on our "this can never happen" list, and on the "this can never happen" list of those people who are even in that country. My question is, with all of this happening at the same time, have we added any bodies or personnel to your agency or any of our agencies to deal with these additional problems, which are on top of all the problems we've historically had? Or did we just move people around and give people additional responsibilities who have been overburdened since the beginning of time?
On the other side of Mara Rudman sits Mark Ward. He represents an entirely new office in the State Department. The Office of Middle East Transitions, headed by Ambassador Bill Taylor, who's currently, I believe, in Tunisia. And this is an office that was set up to address the very issue that you said, that we needed to have a unit in the United States government that could look at these countries in transitions. Now it's Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia fall under this office, and see, are we doing everything in our power
Let me
to be able to
rephrase the
promote
question.
successful transition?
In addition to adding real estate or square footage in the form of an office, have we added additional people, or have we moved other people around, or is this office or its furniture supposed to help solve the problem?
We have done a few different things in the field. We have used, for example, the additional DLIs, and I'm trying to remember what those initials stand for, at the Agency for International Development, a new group of young personnel that have come into the agency over the last several years that have restored a lot of our staff strength. So if you're asking, have they been added specifically with the Middle East transition? No, but have they given us a new group of people that can come out and help us out in the field? Yes. In addition to that, in Tunisia and in Libya, we at USAID have put people into the field in temporary positions at this point to help to do more of the assistance work that's going on there in very small numbers, but we have additional people in those two countries as well with our Office of Transition Initiative staff who are specifically designed.
I'm just unclear. You specifically said new young people. One might suspect that we need some senior thinkers rather than, I got the interns in my office, I think I'll put them on that week. I know Mr. Ward's been around for a long time, and he's given some very useful testimony over the years to our committee. But are we just moving personnel around, or have we actually increased the number of people, experienced people? Have we drawn from other sectors? You know, it doesn't, judging from the answer so far, it seems that we're trying to justify why we haven't, rather than just saying we haven't. And we don't have the resources or the finances to add bodies.
We're working within our existing resources, and Mr. Ward can speak to this as well. He can also explain.
Working within our resources means we haven't added anybody, we've moved people around.
Correct, but I'd also, Mr. Ward can explain the DLI program as well, because that is in fact.
Besides adding
training
initials,
people.
what does it mean?
We-
What's DLI?
It's new Foreign Service officers at USAID. Development Leadership Initiative, I think.
But we've,
It's what I was 25 years ago.
so we've had that program for 25 years. We've added
Always.
nobody because of this problem, or
But-
because of this additional challenge.
What we've done, Mr. Congressman, is, for example, my boss, Ambassador Bill Taylor. Bill was retired, we brought him back. I was working in a completely different bureau at AID and was brought, not working on the Middle East, and I was brought to focus just on this. As Ms. Rudman said, we've created new positions in Tunisia and in Libya and staffed them up with a mixture of junior officers, but also senior officers
But not new officers.
Not new to, but you don't want.
The chairman has been very generous. I'm now 53 seconds above my 5 minutes when a no would have been sufficient, and I would have got the point.
But just so you know, for example, the senior USAID officer in Tripoli is one of the most senior officers that USAID has.
But he was doing something else before that, is my point.
She
We've moved persons around. We've not added. We've not said we need another 12 bodies, rather than say, I'll take 3 bodies from here and 8 bodies from here.
And the gentleman's time's expired, but go ahead if you can briefly answer it, Mr. Ambassador.
Very briefly, in terms of the State Department, we've been able to add a handful of new positions, but for the most part, it has been shifting, looking at what the priorities are, seeing where do we really need surge capacity because of these transitions. So we've been able to respond, but it's mostly been in-house.
And the gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given Mr. Ackerman's question, I was actually reflecting fondly on our first meeting, Mr. Ambassador. I don't know if you recall this, in the room at the Beirut airport where you were effectively trapped for a very long time in that country. So in that regard, I think it's worth noting that your background and commitment to this region provides a deep reservoir of experience as we're going through very complex changes here. So I'm grateful for your service in that regard and the continuity that you have provided. Let me ask a couple of broad questions here. What happened to the Green Movement in Iran?
As I think you know, the 2 leaders of the Green Movement have been under house arrest since February 2011. And sort of second-tier Green Movement leaders have been harassed. In some cases, they have left the country. So there's no new leadership that has emerged to give the Green Movement real direction. The Green Movement still exists. You still see examples of protests across the country, but the sort of leadership function hasn't yet been filled after the house arrest and harassment of the top 2 and the harassment of the second 2. What we've been trying to do, Congressman, is continue to use the programs that we have available to provide tools to civil society inside of Iran, so that they can organize, try to penetrate that electronic iron curtain that the Iranian regime has tried to put around the country, to get information that can hold the government accountable. So we've continued to try to provide tools to civil society actors with the idea that at some point new leadership will emerge that will have better access to information, technology, because of the programs that we're running.
Hold for a moment.
Sure, Mr. Chairman.
I would just note for the record that I had a in-depth conversation with a top Middle East head of government not too long ago, and this very topic came up, and he indicated to me that the Iranian government had filmed all this stuff that was going on, and they're systematically arresting and eliminating not only the individuals involved, but oftentimes entire families are wiped out. That's what the Iranian government is up to in that most reprehensible government that now governs Iran. And I yield back. Thank the gentleman for yielding.
It certainly is a sad and difficult situation, and there were a lot of courageous people who came forward and are still under persecution. It is our hope, though, that in making such commentary like this, that there are responsible people throughout the world who are looking at the possibility of more rational players in Iran coming forward as perhaps a part of a convergence that could change the situation. And in this regard, I want to talk about the economic sanctions and how potentially effective they are. There's a quote out of Iran recently that someone said, the soup is so salty that even the cook can now taste it. In other words, some of these sanctions are beginning to potentially affect even the elites in Iran. Do you think that that is true, that the effective pressures, if you will, on even basic commodity prices are lending themselves to the strengthening of potential new players who could come along and provide more rational outcomes for that situation in terms of new leadership in the future, or are we still in just a wait-and-see period?
I certainly would agree with the comments that these sanctions are having an impact. They're focusing the Iranian regime on the sanctions in a different way. The Iranian regime used to sort of boast that sanctions actually strengthen Iran. You know, that who cares about sanctions? We can do it all ourselves. That's not the case anymore. It's clear that the Iranian regime is looking at these sanctions and are very, very seriously concerned. And let's remember that the real impact of these sanctions, even the current round of sanctions, won't hit until July, when the existing oil contracts in Europe are suspended. So the soup is already salty, even to the cook. It's going to become almost pure sea salt come July, when these oil sanctions continue to hit. And
will this re-empower the potential engagement of new leadership in Iran that would capture the will of the people and bring about the potential for more rational players who can take a more responsible role in the geopolitical scene in the Middle East and on the international stage?
I don't know at this point how long this is going to take, but what is clear is that all the countries that are talking to the Iranians, whether it's countries that still have relationships with Iran, whether it's countries like us using new media to get messages in, we're making it clear to the Iranian people that the reason why these hardships are there, the reason why these sanctions are there, are because of the decisions that their own government leaders are taking.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rudman, speaking of civil society, when I was in Egypt, I met with the Egyptian and other representatives of the NGOs, and there is great concern in Egyptian civil society that the United States, having successfully evacuated its own personnel who were employees of these NGOs, we will abandon the Egyptians left behind who we hired, and an implicit commitment that we'll stand by them. They are still being arraigned. They are still being hauled before a cage in a courtroom. These are bright, young, educated people with passion for trying to remake Egypt into a much more inclusive and participatory kind of society with our encouragement. And they've been labeled as foreign agents and subject to the tender loving mercies of Egyptian justice. What is the position of the United States government? And I can ask you that too, Ambassador Feldman. And what are we doing to protect these young people? And what are we doing by way of representation to the Egyptian government that it is not okay and that we will not abandon these young people? And I believe AID funds these NGOs. I can't hear you.
We'll both respond to the question, but I'll let Mr. Feldman respond first. And then
Okay. Mr. Ambassador.
The Egyptian government should drop all charges against these NGOs. Should drop all charges against these NGOs. They should have dropped all charges months ago against these NGOs, both the American NGOs and the others, German and Egyptian NGOs. We continue to provide legal advice. We've sent lawyers to Egypt to consult with the counsel for the defendants to provide information, advice. We have allowed them to use some of our own funding in order to pay legal bills. We continue to engage the Egyptians at all levels on this case. And I would note, of course, that we went to bat with Interpol when the Egyptians asked Interpol to put out red notices to demand the arrest of 15 NGO workers, including 12 Americans. We immediately engaged with Interpol. Interpol agreed that this was a politically motivated case. They did not disseminate the red notices as requested by the government of Egypt. The government of Egypt should take its cue from Interpol's decision, and drop these charges now.
Sorry. The work that we are doing together, state and AID, so that you're absolutely right, Congressman. We are funding all of these organizations. We are funding a great deal of the legal work that is going on, and our lawyers, state and USAID lawyers, are working hand in hand together in Cairo as well as back here in Washington, continuing to provide the ongoing legal advice as well as in our communications with the government of Egypt.
Well, let me just say, based on my own meetings with Egyptian officials, including at the highest level of the Egyptian military, until and unless the United States makes it painfully clear to them that this is of the highest order of magnitude to us, and that this will affect bilateral relations, including the release and flow of aid money to the military and to the economy, that it will injure our working relationship going forward, that it will affect attitudes certainly here in the Congress, I am concerned that to them it seems like a second-tier issue that will fade in our attention. And I would suggest that the consequences of that are very serious, because I can assure you on both sides of the aisle in this Congress, we're not going to let them go. And if necessary, we'll take legislative action to make that point painfully clear to the administration as well as to the Egyptian government. But more importantly, it has a cascading effect. You've already seen it in the United Arab Emirates. The signal being sent, and I suggest it's being misread. I agree with your respective characterizations, but I don't know that that's been clearly conveyed to the Egyptian government or to others to our satisfaction. And I urge you strongly to make this very clear in all representations to officials of the Egyptian government and the transitional government. It's not okay. We won't forget. We will persist, and this will have consequences.
Thank you for your words on that. We will use those words, Congressman.
That never occurred to me, but feel free. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yielded back his time, and I would like to join the gentleman in his emphasis on this issue and just say loudly and clearly there is bipartisan agreement that the Congress is outraged relative to the treatment of the NGOs by the Egyptian government in this matter. And this is across the board, and Mr. Connolly and I don't agree on too much, but this is one thing that we agree on. We probably agree on some other things too, but thank you very much for making your point. I appreciate it. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it again. Again, on Egypt, the Coptic Christians make up 10% of the population, roughly 13 million people, and have historically been discriminated against and persecuted by the Egyptian government. Unfortunately, this discrimination continues, and Coptic Christians continue to live as lower-class citizens. The question is for the entire panel: what priority, if any, has the State Department given to the plight of the Coptic Christian community? Does the State Department see the Coptic Christian community as an important part of a secure and democratic Egypt? Please give me specifics and explain.
Absolutely, Congressman. We agree with you. In fact, it's not just in Egypt. We see religious diversity, the role of minorities, as being important across the region. It plays into our response to the situation in Syria. It informs how we have engaged Iraqis on their minorities. It's a principle that we use across the region, not solely in Egypt. In Egypt, I had the honor to join Ann Patterson in January for Coptic Christmas in Cairo. We went to 2 different services in Cairo in January to show by our physical presence the U.S. Recognition of the role that Coptic Christians play, of the importance of religious freedom in Egypt. There have been some worrying statements that trouble us coming out of Egypt, and there have also been some more encouraging news. For example, there was an anti-discrimination law that was passed in October that takes away some of the discriminatory practices that you're referring to, that we hope can be built upon with the new government that comes in after July. In addition, Al-Azhar University, the primary Sunni Islamic theological school globally, which is based in Cairo, issued a Bill of Rights, a so-called Bill of Rights a few weeks ago that included very good language on freedom of religion, religion diversity, recognition of the role of the Copts. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood has signed on to that Bill of Rights. This is not enough. In particular, we're concerned about the lack of accountability in cases of sectarian violence. There's been horrible cases of sectarian violence in Egypt throughout this transition, and we've seen very little examples of accountability. We are pressing the Egyptians for the accountability needed to send a very strong message that acts of discrimination, sectarian violence will not be tolerated. But we are already engaged with the current leadership of Egypt, as well as the incoming presumed leaders, the members of parliament, the members of these emerging political blocs, about the principles that should guide any healthy democracy worldwide, the practices that any healthy democracy take in order to ensure freedom of religion, religious diversity, protection of vulnerable minorities, promotion of the role of women, all of these things. We're engaged on this. They're top priorities, sir.
Yes, please.
And I would just add to that, jumping off from what the Assistant Secretary said, in our programs with the Parliament, we've had a tremendous receptiveness from them, tremendous response from across the Parliament in terms of their willingness and interest in engaging in precisely the types of programming that the Assistant Secretary has described. In addition to that, specifically on projects supporting religious freedom and tolerance, we have a project that works with media outlets to broadcast messages that reject extremism and violence and encourage positive dialogue between Muslims and Christians. We have a project that works with educators to disseminate information that's related specifically to tolerance and pluralism and peace building within communities, and is directed towards encouraging that, dealing with vulnerable communities. So those are targeted to the challenges that you're describing with the Coptic Christian communities, and working to draw out the challenges that those communities are facing. And so we are trying very hard to make sure that we have programming that is working to help those communities, as well as looking at programming more broadly that ensures that the concerns of those communities are being dealt with as we're working more broadly across.
Thank you. I too have concerns, along with my colleagues, with the release of this aid to Egypt without restrictions or conditions. How does the state plan to measure moving forward the benefits of releasing this aid to Egypt?
The gentleman's time's expired, but you're free to answer the question if you'd like.
Well, let me emphasize, Congressman, that first of all, we exercise control over these funds at all times during the process. These funds, of course, are expended to pay for goods and services procured in the United States, as part of our military partnership with Egypt, but we retain control over these funds at all times. That allows us to make any adjustments for any significant setbacks that could occur. But we have confidence that the military is serious when the military says they are going to turn over the reins of government to civilian authorities by July, and that's a pretty significant step on the part of the military.
How much has Mr. Chairman, can I ask a quick question?
The gentleman has yielded an additional minute.
Well, I just want to say, how much of the aid has been released so far? Do you intend to release it in increments, just like the Congress intended? How much has been released thus far?
All of the FMF, Congressman, is in a Federal Reserve account over which we retain control. So we retain control over those funds, but all those funds are in the Federal Reserve account from which they can be drawn down for the Egyptian military program.
Anyone else want to add to that? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate giving me the additional time.
Absolutely, yeah, the gentleman's time has
yield back.
expired. Thank you. We'll go to a second round at this time, and I'll yield myself 5 minutes. Ambassador Feltman, we know that approximately 12,000 people, it may be more than that, but that's the figures that we've been using, have died at the hands of the Syrian government in recent months. You noted in your testimony that UN Ambassador Rice has said that we will work to ensure that there are consequences if the Syrian regime continues to ignore the UN Security Council's position on these matters and continues its murderous assaults on their own population. What kind of consequences are we talking about, and what further atrocities have to be committed before these consequences are triggered?
Mr. Chairman, we all would like to see the Annan mission succeed, obviously, in stopping the violence and leading to a political transition. But all of our skepticism is, I think, quite warranted when you see Bashar al-Assad not taking the steps needed to make that mission a success. But we're not stopping and simply waiting and watching while Kofi Annan tries to deploy his monitors. We right now are working on an accountability initiative where we're training people on how to, with international partners, other countries, and expert NGOs on how to gather evidence, preserve evidence, save evidence that can be used for prosecution and for later accountability against regime figures who are committing atrocities. So accountability is one pillar we're continuing to push on, as in reference to your question. We're also increasing, frankly, our assistance to the opposition. Our non-lethal assistance to non-lethal opposition, primarily communication equipment. It's not really a coincidence, Mr. Chairman, that so much more imagery is coming out of Syria today about that the opposition is able to tell its story about what they're facing. It's not really a coincidence, and some of this can be discussed better in a different setting. We're also working internationally to increase the effectiveness of the sanctions regime, because we do not have a Chapter 7 resolution from the United Nations because some countries have blocked that. But what we do have is a lot of like-minded countries who have economic influence on Syria, and we're working together to make sure that our individual bilateral sanctions are coordinated to have a greater impact as a whole. We're continuing to do that. We're not waiting for Kofi Annan's mission to succeed or fail. And finally, we are continuing to address the humanitarian situation in Syria. The United States has now committed over $33 million to help those inside Syria as well as in neighboring countries in need of help. So we're continuing to work on accountability, on opposition support, on the pressure and isolation through sanctions, and on humanitarian, even while we would like to see the Annan mission succeed.
All right, I got 2 minutes left. Let me shift to Iraq. Since its inception, the Iraqi Police Development Program, the PDP, has regrettably been plagued by mismanagement, poor planning. Moreover, senior Iraqi leaders continue to express skepticism about its value. In November of last year, this subcommittee held a hearing on this very topic, and I'm disturbed that the State Department still has not formulated what I would consider a coherent plan that has Iraqi buy-in. The program was originally conceived to be a wide-ranging program involving 350 American advisors at 50 field locations across Iraq. By July 2011, it was reduced in scope by about a half, from 350 American advisors down to 190 advisors, and from 50 field sites down to 28, so just about cut in half. And according to the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, only 86 PDP advisors were in country as of March of last year, March of this year. Furthermore, the State Department's travel warning for Iraq suggests that security restrictions have limited the ability of all U.S. personnel to maintain mobility within the country, which is essential for them to do their jobs. How effectively can the Iraq Police Development Program personnel, and all U.S. government personnel for that matter, execute their mission in the current security environment? Are our current aid programs viable in this environment that we see in Iraq right now?
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I thank the chair, and again, I join the chair in expressing concern about this. As the chair knows, I've raised this in other hearings as well, including with the Secretary of State when the full committee had her.
That's correct.
I would just add, if the chair would allow, one additional concern to the chairman's list, and that is there were no metrics. This is a program that had no metrics. How in the world can we be investing money in a program that has no milestones and no metrics? How can we know whether it's efficacious or not? And there were lots of indications from SIGAR that there was reason to question whether it was efficacious at all. So I would, in your answer to the chairman's question, if the chairman will indulge, absolutely, I would hope you'd also address that issue as well.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia for expounding upon my question, and take such time as you may consume to answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Within reason.
Congressman. We have just performed a semi-annual review of the PDP, of the Police Development Program in Iraq, and probably some of this can be briefed in more detail at a later time. But there were a couple of principal findings that came out of the semi-annual review. First was that in Erbil, up in Iraqi Kurdistan, the program is working as intended. As revised downward, as you described some of the revised downwards. The advisors are able to engage frequently with their Iraqi counterparts. They were able to work up plans of work based on the Iraqi Kurdistan needs in the forensics area and the needs for how to deal nonviolently with civil disturbances, in how to staff and make strong an Inspector General's office inside the Ministry of Interior. So in the semi-annual review indicated that the Erbil program is going as intended.
If I could just stop you right there. What about in the rest of the country? You've focused on that.
The second, there are three primary findings. First was on Erbil. Second was on Baghdad. In Baghdad, it's a mixed bag. There's been a very good committee set up between the Baghdad police and our police trainers to deal with a lot of the emergency security issues. But we have not been able to develop the full range of programs and locations that we had anticipated even after the reduction. The third finding was that in Basra, we're not having the access that we had anticipated. In Basra, we've more or less concluded to keep the program at a very small level. We don't want to pull the program out of Basra because of the importance of Basra to the commercial development of Iraq. It's basically the oil capital. It's also the place where Iran is most focused on trying to make inroads. Now, based on this semi-annual review that just came out, we will be having further revisions of the program, and we'll be looking at exactly what Congressman Conley brought up, which is how do we measure success in a program that has changed quite dramatically since its first conception. You remember when we were designing this program at the same time that the U.S. military was still there having its police program, its security programs, it was all over the country. We now have a far different sort of relationship with Iraq than we had then, and the program has had to be adjusted based on the discussions we've had with the Iraqis, who frankly are quite proud that there's civilian Iraqi sovereign control of Iraqi institutions now.
If I can, I'm going to cut you off there because my time has expired long ago. I would just comment that I think this committee wants to keep very up on what's happening there, and I think they have real concerns, again, in a bipartisan manner. And I would now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Ackerman.
Thank the Chairman. One of the challenges you have is us. It's probably a lot bigger challenge than most people realize. One of the concerns I have vis-a-vis the Middle East is that there are a number of our colleagues who, in order to demonstrate their fealty to the U.S.-Israel relationship, will insist that we have a more prudent or a zero approach to assistance in other countries in the region, thinking that it's an either-or situation, that you have to be against other countries in order to be for Israel, or that we shouldn't be giving money to countries that are not Israel, and to apply all sorts of different kinds of tests to the application of that kind of assistance that is completely unreasonable, illogical, counterproductive, and indeed very, very often destructive of the U.S.-Israel relationship and not helpful at all to Israel's security. It's in Israel's national security interest to have a neighborhood at peace with it. And some of our colleagues and others who are not in Congress, who don't follow this issue as closely, except just by the bare shadows of it, want to know why we would give money to Arab countries at all. Why would we give money to places like Egypt? And we hear that at every hearing and every meeting and every questioning that's done. Why don't we wait and see what's going to happen there? And I don't know how long they want to wait. A year, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. Who's going to be in the region 50 years from now if we're waiting to see? And it would also seem to me, if we're not helpful during these very formative moments in the recreation of some of these countries, that we will have zero influence whatsoever if we withdraw the historic and traditional assistance that we've been providing, even sometimes without metrics, that suddenly becomes withdrawn in the face of a new leadership. My suspicion is they will not have a very good feeling about us. My suspicion is, I've not actually done it, but I would suspect that if somebody would take the time to draw a chart of the countries that we have the most influence with in the region, they're probably the same countries right down the line that we give the most assistance to. So I would suspect if that were the case, which I think it probably is, that we would come to the conclusion that if we want to have more influence, we should be more involved rather than less involved. I don't see the Israelis, who are pretty smart players on the scene, running around screaming and yelling and opposed to assistance to some of their neighbors as I see some of my colleagues. Because Israel knows that it's in their best interest to have stable governments in those countries. To cut people off as they're developing, if you think about it as part of your family, you don't want to cut your kids off when they're at their most vulnerable. And I'm not trying to say that other countries in the region should be treated as our children, because they're not. They're as adult as anybody else, but they're developing as a nation. I don't know how you guys are going to handle that going forward. But I would suggest it's one of the most challenging problems that we have as a nation and a people, and that is we, and I include our colleagues, do not always think. We just have reflexive reactions. I don't like what they did in this country or that country, let's cut them off. Sure, that's a way to get them to love you. That's a way to get them to say, hey, maybe that's a better way. No such thing happens. I would think that you guys, and I suggest this very respectfully, have to stand up to us. You know, we're not shy about putting questions to you. But I would suggest that this process works a heck of a lot better if we're going to be making policy together. And whether some of us are here or some of you are here, you know, next time around is not really the question. It's really how we do this as a nation. And it has to be a dialogue. Turn the questions around. How would you do it? How would we do it? It shouldn't be, you know, the old Soviet niet. You exercise your veto and you get no money for that, but, you know, how are you going to fix the problem? I know I've left you very little time or no time to answer, but if the chairman would indulge, maybe somebody would like to slap me down.
Yes,
Say, may I comment even though it's past time?
go right ahead.
Congressman Ackerman, this is the dilemma
This is why I like this chairman. Not the fact that he is chairman, because we'd be better off if we all were the chairman, but I particularly like this chairman because it's more important for him, as it is for some of us, to get the answer rather than to fit it into 60 square seconds.
You know, this is the dilemma we face, Congressman Ackerman, because we have all these interests. We've all described these interests that we have. We need to pursue these interests. These are our interests in this region that we need to be pursuing. And to pursue these, it's best to do it in an atmosphere of stability and security. But we're not going to have that stability and security if the questions that the Egyptian people, the Tunisian people, the Libyan people, the Syrians have raised over the past year and a half aren't answered in a satisfactory way. And that's one reason why we've proposed this, the Middle East and North Africa Incentive Fund, was to give us the sort of flexibility that allows us to promote and respond to the type of reforms that can have an impact, make a difference, and restore stability, a real stability, by answering some of the questions, the demands that people raised last year. We have a lot of strategic enduring partnerships in this region. Most of our assistance budget that comes from the generosity of the U.S. taxpayers is tied up in strategic enduring partnerships having to do with the FMF to Israel, our commitment to Jordan, things like that. What we have proposed is that we need a tool by which the United States government can respond to the challenges that the Arab Spring poses for us. We need to minimize the risks and maximize the opportunities, and we need a tool to do that. And that's why we have asked for the types of authorities and the levels in the Middle East North Africa Incentive Fund.
Thank you. The gentleman's time's expired. The chair will recognize himself for a minute to make a maybe a point of personal privilege for those of our colleagues who probably fall into the category that the gentleman was referring to about
It's on both sides of the aisle, Mr. Chairman. That
right.
was not a
I understand that. I understand that. That's why I haven't said Republicans or Democrats or
it's not
which
a partisan,
side of the aisle.
We're sometimes dopes. It's a
right. And that's why I said our colleagues, because that you've referred to, and I think they reject the mindset that no matter what our so-called allies around the world do, like Egypt, that there is basically an entitlement to U.S. aid in the form of dollars. And it's not necessarily involvement, because you had talked about, about more involvement in those regions, and that generally means aid, And so we're talking about scarce dollars, and we have a $16 trillion debt. So in the case of Egypt, for example, which is getting a substantial amount of money, and which Congress puts in, and notwithstanding that you're not getting these dollars unless you do this, and then they don't do this, and then the administration, we let them make the decision, well, the money's going anyway, and that's what happened in this case. But anyway, I think a lot of our colleagues reject this entitlement mentality that some other countries around the world have, that they're going to get those dollars no matter what they do, really, within reason. I mean, if they attacked us or something, clearly we're not going to give them money, but they do everything with our NGO folks, which they did, which was a huge slap in the face to the United States. We had our Department of Transportation head, who is a Republican, but was picked by the Obama administration to run that department, and it was his son, who we happened to meet with in Egypt about a year ago with a bunch of NGO folks. And, this guy's basically under house arrest over there and allowed to leave the country. So some Americans were, but there are Egyptians and other folks who are our friends who are still under great personal threat. And yet the Egyptian government seems to be under the impression that they can do all these things and continue to get significant amounts of American aid. And a lot of that goes back to their peace agreement, which they went out on a limb with Israel. And so we support Israel and we support Egypt too, and we've continued to do that. So in any event, in defense of our colleagues who reject that mindset that we're going to continue to push tax dollars in the form of, for lack of a better term, foreign aid, virtually no matter what they do, and no matter how much they reject our positions and our policies. So I'll yield to the gentleman.
Thank you. That was very, very helpful, I think. But let me add to that we can't bite our nose to spite our face, as they say. some years ago, I don't remember what the year was, but there was this Soviet guy at the time named Pavlov. And he was able to train even mice, that they get the reward if they have certain behavior. You know, they ring a bunch of bells around here, we show up at the other side of the maze and cast votes at least 90% of the time, we get to come back here. You know, you can train anybody to do anything. The reason, you know, boldly, if I could suggest, that we started to give large sums of assistance to both Egypt and Jordan was because they both signed peace treaties with the Israelis. We rewarded good behavior. They got the cheese at the end of that. I think we have to be mindful of that as well, and to try to describe to some of our friends in the region what we're looking for, what our expectations are. We don't necessarily know, we know we're not going to get them overnight, especially when there is a new political player in town, in each of their towns, that is going to pander to the populist notions of the moment in order to solidify their power bases and to stay in power. But they have to understand as they develop that this is real life, and we can be helpful or we can be absent. But we have to understand when we're absent, we pay consequences as well. And we have to sit down collectively with our guys on the left and on the right in each of our parties and find out what our expectations are in each place in the world and with each government, because they're all different. The Brotherhood movement is different in different countries. And figure out, as it is, how much we want to invest, how much time we want to give it, and to be flexible enough as things develop that can never predict.
All right, I'm going to get in here, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Are you finished, Mr. Ackerman?
I'm anxious.
Okay, I'm going to
The gentleman from a Commonwealth. whatever
reclaim
that
my
is.
time, and it just goes to show you never know what we're going to discuss in this committee. Things from Pavlov's dog to Pavlov's mice.
We don't always get to talk to each other.
I didn't remember the mice part. I remember the dog part, and I thought it was ringing a bell and feeding him something. Then he would salivate even at the ringing of the bell, but maybe there were mice involved too. It's been a long time since I took high school science. But I will yield back my time, and the gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and if I can just add to the conversation, and I think Mr. Ackerman's right, we don't often get to do this, but and we've had this debate at this committee and full committee last summer in our markup, and I think it's a fair point to raise the question of, hey, aid isn't an entitlement. There has to be accountability. There have to be metrics. Otherwise, it's not worth doing. But neither can we afford as a great power, however, to act as children. Aid is not a crude cudgel that demands slavish devotion to a U.S. agenda at the UN or anywhere else, or else. Aid is a tool. It's an investment. It has a return on it. It doesn't always work, but if you look at things like the Camp David Accords, whatever aid we've poured into that region, not all of it efficient, not all of it yielding the results that are desirable, but the bottom line result is most desirable. It is the longest period of time since the creation of the State of Israel in which its neighbors did not go to war with it. Worth the price. Peacekeeping operations. We don't always like UN around here. Cheap at the price in terms of leveraging other nations to help U.S. diplomacy as well as, we hope, international diplomacy to keep the peace in troubled places without having to have a whole bunch of U.S. troops all over the place. And Iraq and Afghanistan are current reminders of what happens when that diplomacy and those investments fail, or because we got dissatisfied or impatient or juvenile about it and chose to withdraw from the field. And so I think the chairman raises absolutely legitimate concerns. We cannot take the entitlement mentality to the issue of deploying U.S. scarce, limited, precious U.S. assets anywhere in the world. But on the other hand, we have to have a more visionary, broader understanding that this is a tool that serves us. We need to make sure it's effective But sometimes in our political rhetoric, and I certainly do not mean to suggest the chairman, there's one of our colleagues running for president who's actually said, let's defund all foreign aid. Why give it away? My God, we have needs here. It's not an either-or proposition for a great country. These are not choices that we have to make, these in terms of either-or. These are choices that both need to be made. And so I just say that as a word of caution because I happen to believe in the efficacy of foreign aid. I know how easy it is, and again, I do not mean the chairman, for some to demagogue the issue because it's not popular, foreign aid. But if you actually look at its track record, warts and all, it's been a strong investment tool for the United States that's had, in many cases, profound payoff. Let me ask two questions before my time runs out. Real quickly, I also went to Libya with our colleague David Dreyer and the House Democracy Partnership, and you know, we were there one day. We met with the aid mission director, Ms. Rudman, and doing a great job. And we were encouraged, I think, actually, by the ferment and what we were seeing. Things, the difference, I guess, I would characterize, and I wonder what you and Mr. Feldman might think, and certainly yourself, Mr. Ward. Libya isn't set yet. It's in ferment, not clear where it's going to go. There were hopeful signs. There was lots of excitement and enthusiasm still, and we're trying to be a worthwhile partner with those who would like to put it on a civil society, inclusive, participatory kind of democracy over time that respects minority rights, et cetera. Egypt, I fear, is more set. Political ferment, in some ways, has settled, and it's quite clear what's emerged from that. And the issue there is, are they the real thing, or are they going to revert to previous form? And if so, we've got real problems in the largest Arab country in the world. I just wonder, I invite you, if the chairman will indulge it, because I took an extra minute just to share my views, if the chairman would allow our witnesses simply to answer that question, and I will then retire from the field.
Take a minute or so to complete, and the committee will be wrapping up then, whoever is most appropriate to answer the question. Mr. Ward?
Well, I appreciate the reference, Congressman, to Libya. I spent about 4 or 5 months in Libya with the United Nations between September and February. And I will tell you that one of the most exciting things for the United States Embassy, every other international embassy in town, and the United Nations was the excitement in civil society that you talk about. I remember a day sitting with the Deputy Prime Minister in his office where there was a protest raging out on the street. And it was so loud we couldn't really have our conversation. And I expressed some frustration. And he sat back in his chair with a big smile and he said, "Isn't this great? This is the way it's supposed to be. Let them carry on. We can go meet down the hall." And their willingness to invite civil society, which has such a voice in ensuring that these transitions continue to go in the right direction, to participate in their deliberations, to participate as our government does in creating laws, in providing comment, is very encouraging. And we're seeing the same hopeful signs next door in Tunisia. But you're right, this is something that we're going to have to keep an eye on going forward with the new Egyptian government.
Oh, you mentioned Egypt, Mr. Congressman Conley, and I agree. We have a new Egypt emerging. It's an Egypt that we don't know, or at least we don't know completely. We may never know completely, but it's in our interest to try to see if we can build new partnerships with the emerging Egypt, as well as to maintain our existing partnerships with Egypt business, with the Egyptian educational institutions, with the Egyptian military. Because, you know, you look at a map, Egypt's going to remain Israel's neighbor. Egypt's going to remain the neighbor to Sudan on one side, Libya the other. We have interests that transcend Egypt, but that need Egypt to be part of the solution. So we are committed to using all the diplomatic tools we have to cultivate new partnerships and protect our old partnerships in Egypt.
Okay, the gentleman's time's expired. We want to thank the panel for their testimony here this afternoon. I think it's been very helpful. Members will have 5 days to supplement their statements or to ask questions. If there's no further business to come before the committee, we're adjourned. Thank you very much.